Colorado Territory, August 1872. The morning air was dry and sharp, dust curling off the road as Florence Carrigan stood barefoot on the front porch of her father's ranch house, clutching her belly and her pride. The wooden floorboards still held the heat of last night, but her skin was cold. She had never seen her father's face look like that before. Stone set, eyes narrowed, mouth tight like he was holding back a slap. "You're not my daughter anymore," he had said. "You walk out of here carrying that shame, you don't come back." The baby inside her shifted, 6 months along. She did not cry. Her tears had dried up days ago when her letters to the child's father went unanswered. He had gone east for work and never wrote back. She had held out hope. Now there was nothing left to hold. She walked for more than 2 hours, the sun beating down and the grit sticking to her legs. Her shoes, a pair of worn boots that barely fit, had been taken from her by her father. "You do not get to take anything from this house," he had said. She had left with only a small sack of bread and a flask of water. Each step jarred through her back and her breath caught more than once from the strain, but she kept going. When she finally saw the outline of the cattle fence and barn in the distance, her knees nearly gave. She had not meant to come here, not to him, not like this. The ranch was quiet, save for the lowing of cattle and the creak of a windmill turning slowly overhead. She reached the gate and leaned against the post, breath shallow, her vision blurred from heat and exhaustion. "Florence," a voice called behind her. She turned. He stood in the barn's shadow, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve, a rifle slung low against his hip. He looked older than she remembered, broader, the sun having darkened his skin, lines carved deeper around his eyes. But it was him. "Vernon Bell," she said, her voice hoarse. His boots thudded across the dirt as he crossed to her. "You all right? You look like hell." "I need help," she said, and then her legs gave out. He caught her before she hit the ground. When she woke, she was lying on a cot inside the house, the smell of leather and sagebrush in the air. Vernon sat in a chair nearby, elbows resting on his knees, watching her. "You fainted," he said quietly. "Been out near an hour." She tried to push herself up. "Easy," he said, rising to help her. "You need to drink something first." He handed her a cup of water. She drank it slow, her hands trembling. "I got thrown out," she said without looking at him. He nodded once. "Figured." "I do not have anywhere to go." He stared at her for a moment. "You do now." She looked up, eyes filling before she could stop them. "I do not want your pity, Vernon." "It isn't pity," he said. "It is respect, and maybe something else too." He turned, gave her space to breathe. That night, she sat on the porch wrapped in a quilt, watching the stars come out. Vernon brought out a tin plate of stew and sat beside her, quiet. He did not ask questions. He did not press her. Just ate beside her, his leg brushing hers once. "I never thought I would come back here," she said softly. "I never thought you would need to," he replied, "but I hoped you might." She looked over at him. "You hoped," he nodded. She stared at him for a long moment. "Vernon, this is not your problem, maybe not. But I want it to be." In the days that followed, he cleared a space in the barn loft for her to rest during the heat, hung a curtain for privacy, and made sure she had what she needed. She tried to help where she could, feeding the chickens, sweeping the porch, but her body tired quickly. He never let her overdo it. She watched him from the window sometimes, the way he moved with purpose, how he spoke low to the horses, how he stopped to pick wildflowers and leave them in a jar on the table without a word about it. He was not the boy she had known at 16. He had become something steadier. She caught herself smiling when he entered a room one evening. He brought her a small carved horse made of pine. "For the baby," he said, "when they are old enough." She turned it over in her hands. "You made this," he shrugged. "Helps me think." Florence swallowed hard. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not have to," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him. "I want to." He met her eyes. "Then stay. Raise your child here with me." Her breath caught. "I know I am not the father," he said. "But I could love them, and I could love you." She stared at him, stunned. "I already do," he added. Her hand found his, warm and calloused. "I think I have loved you since before I knew what it meant," she whispered. He leaned in. She did not stop him. When their lips met, it was slow and full of everything they had been holding in. She felt safe for the first time in months, maybe years. That night, she fell asleep in his bed, wrapped in his arms, her back to his chest and his hand resting gently on her belly. The baby kicked once and Vernon smiled against her shoulder. "Feels like they are saying hello," he whispered. Florence closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. This was not the life she had planned. It was better. The September wind carried the scent of hay and ironweed across the pasture, brushing the tall grass like a hand smoothing over a restless child. Florence sat beneath the cottonwood behind the barn, her knees bent, her fingers brushing the dry earth. The hem of her dress was dusted from following Vernon out to check fences that morning. She'd stayed behind when he climbed the ridge, saying she needed to rest. Truth was, she needed quiet. The baby moved like it was stretching. She placed her palm over the swell, steadying herself. "They sleep when I walk," she said aloud to no one, "and wake when I stop." Vernon's voice came from behind, soft enough not to startle. "Then I hope they'll forgive me for asking you to stay off your feet a while longer." She turned to see him carrying a coil of wire over one shoulder, a length of fencing tool strapped across his back. He set the wire down and crouched beside her, his breath still ragged from the climb. "The east line's holding," he said. "But deer got tangled in the north corner. Might be time for wood posts instead of barbed." Florence nodded. "You'll need help with that. I'll manage. You've got enough to carry." He dug into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "Found this near the creek bed. Thought maybe it belonged to someone." Inside was a child's bonnet, sun-faded and frayed at the edges. She ran her thumb along the seams. No one's lived up that way in years. Still seemed like something worth saving. She folded the bonnet gently and handed it back. "You always do that, pick up what others lost." He looked at her then, not with pity, not with hesitation, but with something steadier. "Only the things that matter." The silence between them held like a beam across a frame, not heavy, just strong. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low and turned the hills bronze. They walked back together, Vernon's stride easy beside her slower pace. He kept a hand on the small of her back when they crossed the ditch, steadying her without a word. Inside the house, he'd left something simmering on the stove. She caught the scent of beans and dried chili. He stirred the pot with one hand and reached for a tin from the shelf with the other. "You ever cook with mesquite honey?" he asked. She shook her head. "I never had the chance to try." He poured a small spoonful into the bubbling pot. "It softens the bite, makes it easier to swallow." She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "You always this careful with your cooking?" He looked over his shoulder. "Only when I'm feeding someone I care about." That night she couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. She rose from the bed, wrapped in one of his old shirts, and stepped out to the porch. The lantern still burned low beside the door. She sat on the top step, arms around her knees, watching the clouds move fast across the moon. She didn't hear him come out, but then there he was, lowering himself beside her quietly. "You all right?" he asked. "I keep thinking about what kind of mother I'll be." He didn't answer right away, just looked out over the pasture, thoughtful. "My ma used to say being a parent was mostly showing up, being there even when you don't know what to say." Florence nodded. "I'm scared I won't know how." Vernon stretched his legs out in front of him, boots tapping the wood. "You don't have to know everything, you have to want to learn." She turned to face him. "And you still sure about this?" He didn't blink. "I've never been surer of anything." She reached for his hand, he let her take it. "You'll be the only father this child knows," she said. "That means something?" He looked down at their joined hands. "It means everything." The wind quieted for a while, the night settled. And for the first time since she'd been cast out, she felt the weight of her future lesson just enough to breathe. The first frost came early that year, silvering the tops of the fence posts and turning the fields brittle before dawn. Vernon was chopping wood behind the house, his breath visible in the morning air, when Florence called to him from the doorway. "There's a letter," she said, holding the envelope between two fingers as though it might burn. He wiped his hands on his trousers and came to stand beside her, scanning the unfamiliar handwriting. The envelope was creased and dirty, the seal cracked with dust. "Postmark says Cheyenne," she added. "It's from him." He looked at her face, not the letter. "I should rate it," she said, voice even. "You can," he said, "or you can throw it in the stove. I don't know what I want. Then keep it until you do." She tucked the letter beneath the flour tin on the shelf and didn't speak of it again that day. Later, as dusk settled, she sat in the root cellar sorting potatoes by the light of a lantern. Vernon lowered himself onto the step beside her, dirt still on his palms from repairing the barn's latch. "I passed old Mr. Larkin on the trail," he said. "He asked if I'd taken a wife." Florence glanced up, amused. "What you tell him?" "That I hadn't yet, but I was working on it." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Is that what this is, work?" "It's something worth tending," he said, "like a fence line. Or a fire in winter." She leaned back against the stone wall, eyes closed a moment. "I used to think I had to earn love," she said. "Make myself good enough, quiet enough, be what folks expected." He didn't speak, just waited. "I see now I never stood a chance with a man like that." Not once I stopped agreeing with everything he said. "You don't have to explain it to me. I'm not. I'm saying it out loud because I want to stop carrying it." The lantern made shadows of their faces on the wall. Vernon reached down and took her wrist gently. "You're not alone in this." "I know that now," she said, and for the first time she meant it. The next morning she rose early before the rooster and lit the stove herself. She boiled oats, sliced the last of the apples, and waited for him to come in from the barn. When he did, she handed him a cup of coffee and sat across from him, her hands folded. "I read the letter," she said. He kept his eyes on the rim of his mug. "He said he's sorry, said he was scared, that it wasn't the life he thought he wanted." Vernon nodded once. "And what do you want?" "I want to stay," she said. "I want to raise this child with someone who doesn't flinch when things get hard. I want to build something with you, if you'll still have me." He set the cup down and rose from his chair. "I built the gate wide enough for two," he said. "I've been waiting for you to walk through it." He held out his hand. She stood and stepped into his arms. That night, she brought a small carving knife from the kitchen drawer and sat beside Vernon by the hearth. In her hand was a length of cottonwood he'd left on the porch weeks before. She began to whittle, slow and careful, her thumb guiding the blade the way he'd shown her once long ago. "What are you making?" he asked, watching her fingers move. "A cradle ornament," she said. "Something to hang above the baby's head." He pulled a blanket over her knees and rested his hand on her thigh. "You'll be a good mother," he said. "I'll be the kind who learns," she replied. And in that quiet room, with firelight flickering on the walls and wood shaving away beneath her hands, Florence Carrigan felt the last of her old life peel away. What remained was this: a man beside her, a child on the way, and a home built not from what had been taken, but from what had been chosen. By mid-October, the aspens along the creek had turned to fire. Their golden leaves scattered across the yard and gathered in drifts against the porch steps. Florence swept them in slow arcs each morning, careful of her balance, though the weight of the child had shifted low in her belly and made her tire sooner than before. "I can finish that," Vernon said behind her, his coat still damp from the pre-dawn mist. He took the broom without waiting for her to answer and leaned it against the rail. "Come sit a while. You've been on your feet too long." She let him guide her to the bench and handed him the letter that had been folded into her apron pocket. "It came with the post rider," she said. "From my Aunt Ruth in Cannon City." He turned the envelope over in his hands. "Your mother's sister," she heard what happened, said she's sorry for it. Florence watched a crow land on the fence rail and added, "She invited me to stay with her. Offered a room and some sewing work." Vernon kept his eyes on the letter. "Are you thinking of going? I thought I should tell you before I answered." He sat beside her, jaw tight. "If it's security you want, I'll never fault you for choosing it. It isn't that." She traced the grain of the bench with one finger, then looked up at him. "I wanted to see what you'd say." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I say this is your home if you want it." Not because you fell into it, but because you chose it. And if you'd rather be with your kin, I'll still make sure you and the baby have what you need. I don't want charity, Vernon. It isn't charity, it's loyalty. She slipped the letter back into her pocket. I already made my choice. I just needed to hear it out loud. He nodded, then reached over and laced his fingers with hers. For a while, they listened to the wind move through the trees. That evening, the midwife came up from the valley misses. Redfield, a widow with a calm voice and hands that smelled faintly of cloves. She brought linens, a small crate of medicinal roots and a chipped kettle for boiling water. She's measuring right where she ought to be, Mrs. Redfield said after checking Florence's belly, but the child's dropped low. Won't be long now. Florence rubbed the base of her spine. I've felt it, like I'm carrying a stone under my ribs. The older woman smiled. That's how you know it's nearly time. Vernon stood near the doorway, hands folded behind his back. Anything I should be doing, Mrs. Redfield packed her satchel and gave him a long look. Keep the fire steady, keep her fed, and when the hour comes, keep your voice low and your fear quieter. After she left, Florence sat by the stove, turning a bundle of baby cloths over in her lap. Do you think I'll know what to do when it happens? She asked. Vernon crouched beside her, resting a hand on her knee. I think you already do. You've carried this child through shame and heat and hard ground. You've done the hardest part. She looked at him, eyes searching. Will you be there? When the time comes, there's nowhere else I'd be. The next morning, he hitched the wagon and drove her down to the creek flats where the wild rye grew tall. She leaned against his shoulder as they watched two deer drink from the far bank, their ears twitching at every sound. I used to dream of running, she said. Out past the hills, no name, just distance. What changed? I realized I wasn't looking to run, I was looking to belong. Vernon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a square of muslin. It isn't much, he said, placing it in her hands. Inside was a silver ring dull with age, the band thin but strong. It was my mother's, he said. It's been sitting in a drawer for years, waiting for someone with steady hands and a braver heart than mine. Florence held it carefully, her breath caught behind her ribs. This doesn't have to be today, he said, or tomorrow, but I want you to wear it. When you're ready. She turned her hand in his and he slid the ring onto her finger. I'm ready, she said. He kissed her then, not with fire, but with the quiet certainty of a vow made not in church, but in the open air, beneath the same sky that had carried them through every silence, every turn of the road. They stayed until the sun dipped low, the child in her belly pressing forward as if to remind them it wouldn't wait much longer. And neither of them was afraid. The baby came on a windless night when the sky was thick with stars and the last of the leaves had fallen from the cottonwoods. Vernon had stoked the fire high and carried extra buckets from the well before dusk, without being asked. Florence had spent the afternoon laying out fresh linens and steadying her breath whenever the ache curled through her spine. When it deepened into something heavier, something that pulled from the base of her bones, she called for him without needing to raise her voice. Mrs. Redfield arrived just before midnight, her shawl damp from the ride, her breath quick but calm. The house was warm and quiet, the only sounds the low hum of the fire and Florence's breathing as it changed, deeper and steadier. Vernon waited just beyond the bedroom door, seated on a stool with his elbows on his knees, listening for anything that might tell him how to help. Hours passed slow and thick. At one point he heard Florence cry out not sharp, but low and deep, and he gripped the edge of the stool so tight his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Redfield's voice followed, measured and sure, guiding Florence through the storm. Then, as dawn broke thin across the far ridge, there was a silence. A silence so complete it rang in his ears. And then soft, strong, unmistakable, a newborn's cry. Vernon rose without knowing he had, standing frozen until Mrs. Redfield stepped into the hall, her sleeves rolled and her face damp but smiling. She's asking for you, she said. He stepped into the room with care, his boots barely making a sound on the floorboards. Florence lay propped against the pillows, her hair clinging to her temples, her cheeks flushed. In her arms, wrapped in a wool blanket, was a small, blinking bundle of life. "It's a girl," she said, her voice hoarse but full. He crossed to her side and knelt, his hands shaking as he brushed his fingers over the child's tiny head. "She's here," he whispered. Florence nodded and looked at him, her eyes clear. "I want to name her Ruth, after the woman who remembered me when no one else did." He met her gaze and smiled. "Ruth Bell, then." Florence let out a soft breath and leaned her temple against his shoulder. That afternoon, as the sun rose higher and melted the frost from the yard, Vernon carried a basin of water out to the porch and poured it over the steps, washing away the last of the bloodied linens. He moved with purpose, but not urgency. Everything in him had quieted. A stillness he hadn't known he needed had settled into his bones. Inside, Florence sat in the rocker by the window, the baby asleep against her chest. She watched Vernon through the glass, one hand resting over the child protectively, the other curled around the carved horse he'd given her months ago. When he came back in, he set his hat on the peg and crossed to her side. He crouched again, just as he had the first time he saw her swollen with child, and looked up into her face. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known," he said. She smiled, slow and tired and full. "You've given me room to be." He leaned forward and kissed her gently. No heat, no hunger, just the kind of kiss that comes from knowing a life has changed and being grateful for it. They built the cradle together 2 days later, Vernon cutting the slats smooth while Florence sanded and oiled them by the fire. Ruth slept in a woven basket during the day, swaddled in wool and tucked close where Florence could reach her. At night, she fussed only lightly, soothed by the sound of Vernon's voice as he hummed old songs under his breath, pacing slow across the room. The neighbors came in pairs to offer bread, jars of preserved fruit, and quiet congratulations. No one asked questions anymore. Florence was no longer the girl who'd been turned out. She was Mrs. Bell now, in all but paper, and the way Vernon stood behind her when they spoke made it clear she had nothing to prove to anyone. One chilly morning, while the fields lay dormant and the wind whistled through the chimney, Florence reached into the top drawer of the bureau and pulled out the letter from her aunt. She unfolded it once more, read the gentle words, then placed it in the hearth and watched it curl into ash. She had no bitterness in her heart, only clarity. Her road had already forked, and she had chosen the one that mattered. That evening, she came to Vernon holding Ruth in one arm and the silver ring in the other. "I think we ought to make it proper," she said. He took both in his hands, his daughter and his promise, and nodded once. They married under the cottonwood behind the barn, just the three of them and Mrs. Redfield standing witness. Vernon wore his cleanest shirt, and Florence had sewn ribbons into her best dress. Ruth cooed in her arms throughout the vows. As they kissed, the wind rustled through the bare branches overhead, like applause from the land itself. Years passed, marked by the rhythm of rains and droughts, calves and harvests. Florence taught Ruth how to braid her hair and patch worn hems. Vernon showed her how to hold a hammer and listen for the hollow sound in a fence post gone soft. One spring, they built an addition onto the house, 2 more rooms and a front parlor with tall windows that caught the morning light. They filled it with books, quilts, and quiet joy. Ruth grew strong and kind with her mother's eyes and her father's steadiness. Once, when Ruth was nearly 5, Florence found Vernon sitting on the porch at dusk, whittling a new figure. "What's this one for?" she asked, settling beside him. "For her," he said, nodding toward the window where Ruth slept. "A woman should have stories carved for her, not just carried." Florence reached for his hand and laced her fingers with his. "I never thought happiness would be carved out of the hard parts," she said. He kissed her knuckles. "It always is." And they sat like that until the stars came out, 2 souls bound by the quiet work of love earned, tended, and made to last.